Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our 11 a.m. session. My name is Judy, and I will be moderating the first portion of our session today. We are
Sesión de la mañana.
currently in the
Actualmente
housing Pomona session.
estamos en la sesión de Pro-Housing en Pomona.
I would like,
con respecto
before
a la
we get
primera etapa de
started, to
planeación
just give a few Zoom
del
reminders.
Departamento de
So we do
Desarrollo
have
Urbano. Y me
translation
gustaría
services available.
recordarles que tenemos
So
el
if you
servicio de
follow the
interpretación
instructions
simultánea
on the
disponible.
screen here,
Si
you
ustedes
will
ven
be able to select the
lo que
language
tenemos
of your
aquí en
choice.
pantalla, ustedes van a
And we
poder
also
elegir
ask
el
if you are hearing the Spanish translation at the same time to mute the original audio. So with that in mind, we have Anita Gutierrez and Ata Khan here with us, and I will let them begin sharing their screen and start our presentation. I also want to let folks know that we will have time for questions at the end. So feel free to start thinking about those questions. We'll open it up for questions at the end of the session. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Judy. And while Ata's getting that screen going, I'll just say a few brief words. So again, my name is Anita Gutierrez. I'm the Director for Development Services, overseeing the Department of Development Services, overseeing planning and building and safety within the city of Pomona. And our department is charged with preparing the housing element, which is a component of the general plan for the city of Pomona. So we're very excited to be sharing the very first snippets of it with this audience. We just released it yesterday for our draft public review period. So we're very excited to be rolling this out and starting to get and continue to get community feedback on this draft. I will say, as many of you are probably aware, the number of our regional housing allocation is 10,558, which is a high number if you look at it just from a numbers perspective. But the perspective that we've taken in the city of Pomona and within my department is not looking at the number specifically. I think it's a number that we can accommodate, and some of the measures we'll get into throughout the presentation. The number we can accommodate within the given constraints of our development framework already within the city, and that's kind of being set up from actions being taken over the last several years, and where that kind of puts us in a really good position. What we've been focusing on, and I think you'll see again through the presentation, is quality programming to ensure that the programs and policies that we're putting forth that will help guide our housing policy for the next 8 years till 2029 are ones that resonate with the community, that reflect our goals and values, and that push us forward in a progressive manner to try to really think innovatively about how we can house the populations within the city of Pomona. And so over the last 6 months, maybe a little bit longer, we've been doing a lot of different outreach in different ways, kind of building up the momentum towards this goal of this Pro-Housing Pomona document. And so, and that was purposeful. So that way, when we drafted this, it was also being very inclusive of what we've already heard directly from the community, from the council. And so I hope that those ideas that you've expressed over the last few months in different forums with our team, I hope that you find those reflected in the programs and policies that we're going to go briefly into. And if you don't, please let us know. We will, this is definitely a draft, and we want to hear from the community about what we might do better at, what we might include. And so we look forward to that conversation. So with that, I'll turn it over to Ata, who's gonna take us through this draft document.
Thanks, Anita, and good morning, everybody. And thank you for spending your Saturday morning with us here as we roll out our new public draft of the Pro-Housing Pomona document. And before I begin, Anita, does it look okay on your screen there? Can you see everything?
Yeah, it looks great.
Okay. So as a starting point, and not to dive too deep into the
bueno, para comenzar,
purpose of
quiero ver cuál es el propósito.
Sorry, I'm hearing the translation at the same time.
Quiero ver si están escuchando.
I just muted her. I think that should help.
Okay, great. Thank you. So really trying to understand first is what's the purpose of this document that we're calling Pro Housing Pomona? And so as Anita mentioned, there's really two things going on here. The first is, of course, compliance with state law. Every local jurisdiction has a general plan. It's a blueprint for how the city grows into the future. Pomona has one as well that was recently updated in 2014. Part of that, one of those chapters, is a housing element. It's a state mandated chapter, and our cycle is to update it every 8 years. So when you see the term sixth cycle, it just simply means that our cycle is between 2021 and 2029. One of the key features, just like Anita mentioned about RHNA, is the document has to demonstrate how we're going to be able to accommodate the number of units allocated to Pomona, that 10,558 number. But building on what she had just mentioned, the second purpose of the document specific to Pomona is really what we call Pro Housing Pomona. So the definitive vision really for Pomona's housing goals, policies, and programs for the next 8 years. As part of that Pro Housing Pomona program, we are seeking a state designation that you may be familiar with that was launched in July 1st by HCD, the Housing and Community Development Department, for jurisdictions to apply formally to become a pro-housing city. And what that enables Pomona to do, if it was awarded, would be to have priority placement on state funding for affordable housing production, among many other benefits. So the city felt that it was important to align with those priorities and to really move beyond numbers and to really think about what the community needs and how we can address that. So with that said, let's get into the document a little bit. It's 9 different PDFs, it's 550 pages. It can be overwhelming at first glance if you go on our website, but the purpose of today is to break that down for all of you and to share those with your stakeholders and your neighbors and to really get feedback on over the next 30 days on what you think of it. And so there's 5 key parts to the Pro Housing document. The first is a housing needs assessment. The city conducted a needs assessment to understand what the data is telling us and really what the community is saying about housing. We also study existing housing constraints or barriers that exist right now that prevent affordable housing production and affordable housing development in the city of Pomona. After looking at that in section 3, we look at housing resources. So what do we have to our advantage in the city of Pomona right now? What can we play into that we're already doing that would really accelerate housing production and affordability and tenant protections and anti-displacement measures? Section 4 is about fair housing. As a state and federal rule, the Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing Initiative is to really study fair housing challenges with respect to barriers to housing in the city of Pomona. And so we did study that as well. And then lastly is the plan for Pro Housing Pomona. How do we take sections 1 through 4 and then synthesize them into what is this draft plan for the next 8 years made up of 5 goals of how we intend to approach housing in the city of Pomona. So let's go into these in turn. Start with
before you dive in, Ata, I just wanted to comment for everyone, everyone's benefit. I think what you'll find with this document, you may not all read a ton of housing elements, but we certainly have. And I think what we've tried to do here with this iteration of this document is really make it community and user friendly. A lot of document, and you'll see that in how we've divided the sections and then put all kind of the appendices and data in the back to support it. A lot of housing documents we found it's very difficult to read. What is this kind of telling me? So Ata has really led that effort in really trying to synthesize all of the data that comes along with the housing element and structure it in a way that is understandable, not only for the community, but for staff and policymakers. So I hope that comes across as well. And I just wanted to highlight that of the work that Ata and the planning team have done.
Yeah, absolutely. And definitely appreciative of the team effort on that. And so section 1 is the housing needs assessment. And so a couple of key findings here that you can read further into the document. But before we go into it, again, the 2 sources. So what is a housing needs assessment? First, we're looking at publicly available data. We're looking at the United States Census Bureau and the American Community Survey. We're looking at regional data from the Southern California Association of Governments. We're looking at data from the Housing and Urban Development Department at the federal level, state HCD numbers, employment and job numbers, different indices that different universities or think tanks may put together to really see what is this data saying about housing, employment trends, and population in the city of Pomona. On top of that, we conducted a rigorous amount of public engagement to date over the last 6 months, including bilingual surveying, a housing leadership academy that was led by Neighborhood Services that included 30 participants locally, and a host of community forums to ask a lot of questions to really validate that data or to substantiate it or to add more context and nuance to those needs. So what do we learn from this needs assessment? Well, first, there are just some unique challenges for Pomona's population. First off, we intend to, per census data, Pomona intends to grow over 30,000 people by 2040. So there is population growth, as with many other cities, expected in the city of Pomona. There isn't population decline expected or a steadiness, but quite frankly, an increase of population over the next 20 years. Now, within that population, what we're noticing over the last 10 years is that Pomona's population is aging while its youth population is actually declining. Now, neighboring cities like Claremont have already a higher senior level population of 65 plus than Pomona, but Pomona's population is steadily aging. But interestingly, if you look at Pomona Unified School District data on enrollment's declined over the last couple of years. And it's unclear whether that's happening because of declining birth rates in certain neighborhoods or for some other reason. But it is an important characteristic to understand as you dive into housing needs and really the segment of the population we're serving. 7 out of 10 of Pomona residents identify as Hispanic or Latino in the census population. That's also a very important statistic. That's higher than the county average. It's far higher than the majority of cities in Los Angeles County. And quite frankly, it's among the top 10 in the country. Pomona has a very high number of Hispanic or Latino population. And that definition of Hispanic or Latinos is a census term definition that we use for ease of reference as data is organized around that metric. Now, why is that unique? Because coming up with housing goals and policies becomes really important to understand the cultural norms and practices of the residents that live in your community, right? So lastly, Pomona does have a high rate. Over 18,000 residents are college students or recent graduates. And so there's a high rate of college students living in the area. We have multiple institutions like Western University, Cal Poly Pomona. So that's a little bit of glimpse of our housing population. Now, as we dive a little deeper, a couple of things here. Almost 1 out of 5 households in Pomona are headed by a single female parent. A single parent household led by a female. That's higher than the county. The poverty rate among our single parent female households is among the highest in Los Angeles County. In addition to that, over 1 out of 5 homes, 23% of our households are actually considered non-family. This could be people living alone or people living unrelated to each other in a group or co-living or student living situation. Another quarter of our population, 26% of our households, are considered large with more than 5 persons living in that household. And 31% of those households across Pomona are considered overcrowded, which is defined as more than 1 person living per room. So we have households that are increasingly female-headed, non-family, large, and multi-generational. A little bit about that overcrowding metric. So when we looked as staff at overcrowding data, we were trying to reconcile that against the reality of our 7 out of 10 Hispanic or Latino population, and also cultural norms and practices among other minority populations in Pomona, which really support the narrative of multi-generational living. And so we wanted to really parse out the reasons overcrowding occurs, because the data may suggest that it's only happening out of financial necessity, although that's not quite true. And so there's really 3 reasons in our estimate that overcrowding is occurring in Pomona. The first is indeed financial necessity. Folks can't afford independent living, so they are living with their families or in a household non-family arrangement. But the second is cultural preference. Cultural preference is a really key metric to study of intentional crowdedness in homes and folks living across multiple generations for ease of care, just out of norms and practices, or any other reason to support a large household setup. And that definitely is taking place in the city of Pomona. And then lastly, zoning limitations. So we have talked about ADUs this morning, and we're going to continue talking about that a little bit today. But ADUs were a solution to kind of get beyond some of the zoning limitations in our neighborhoods where you could only build one primary home and there wasn't any ability to really expand your property and build more living spaces. So zoning limitations can play a factor to actually lead to some overcrowding because you can't build enough house. We also have housing needs to address disabilities, extreme poverty and homelessness, really key issues. Ambulatory disabilities are the primary physical disability in the city of Pomona, in addition to developmental disabilities based on the data that we're seeing. There's special housing needs and reasonable accommodations that need to be met, universal design that we need to be aware of in our housing policy. 8,300 of our households are considered extremely low income. It's a very high number, and also plays into some determinants of housing access and affordability and displacement. And then lastly, we have 700 plus persons experiencing homelessness based on most recent in-person homelessness count from when last conducted. And as you know, we have the Hope for Home shelter, which we'll talk about in a moment to address that, among other continuum of care programs. So let's talk employment trends real quick. This is also important in the needs assessment. Over the last 10 years, our manufacturing job base has declined locally in a significant fashion. At the same time, we've increased in our education, healthcare, social service sector, and our professional management sector. Now, when you look at the mean salaries in those industries among Pomona's workforce, they're aligned with what's considered moderate income, so 80 to 120% of area median income. Sometimes you'll hear this called workforce housing or missing middle housing. Pomona is definitely seeing in the data a need for workforce and middle income housing, as our employment population represents industries and jobs that are moderate income. And that's a clear need that came out of the data as well. When it comes to unit type, housing types by design, the majority of majority of housing in Pomona is limited to single detached units on single lots. So 63% of our housing right now in the city of Pomona is a single unit detached on a home that's zoned for single family zone. Now, as part of our public surveying, and this is where we're starting to bring in some of that community input that we received, public surveying in Pomona is supporting broadening that type of housing, support for housing for special needs population as well, support for alternative construction methods such as modular housing, but really thinking beyond the single unit and thinking about other housing types that can be accommodated in Pomona, since nearly 2/3 of our housing is the same housing type. And as you can see from some of our demographic needs, that simply won't accommodate our needs. There's also support for building. Where can we build this housing? If we're limited to single units, where else can we build housing? Folks mentioned city-owned lots. Folks mentioned vacant parcels, redeveloping houses of worship in the city of Pomona, building within existing space as live, work, and artist lofts, converting motels and hotels, a whole host of ways that the city broadly was open to a lot of different ways of accommodating multiple housing types in Pomona. Now, in addition to actually the build and the housing stock, the community has serious concerns about displacement. That's what came through in our surveying. Concerns about displacement, concerns about unstable rent prices, concerns about tenant protections and evictions, and generally about housing affordability. It's too expensive to find homes, or there's no price point or option for somebody's income. So the surveys support rental assistance and first-time homebuyer programs that the city of Pomona could help with. They support low to no cost ADU programs to support the creation of ADUs, support for regulatory tools. There's been a lot of talk about an interest in rent stabilization and rent control, eviction moratoriums, limiting the flipping of homes and residential private equity speculation. Those are all real, tangible fears that many residents in our surveys expressed in the city of Pomona. So in addition to that, as a means to address some of that, residents were interested in alternative models of property ownership. Are there other ways of stabilizing homeownership and neighborhood scale through things like a community land trust or through other cooperative or alternative financing models that may limit the acceleration of some of that private equity that's sloshing around in the markets? Now, with that, at a neighborhood level, quality of life is critical, right? And that came through as well in the surveying. There's a clear need for rehab and repair of our homes. 86% of our homes were built before 1990. And 1990, begrudgingly, I must say, is over 30 years old now. And so the housing stock is old, and it's getting older. There's housing problems that the data suggests with relation to sanitation, kitchen facilities, overcrowding, as I mentioned. There's demand for walkable, safe neighborhoods, more recreation and open space within the neighborhood scale. And then lastly, while we are increasing density, the parking remains a top concern for livability for residents. Many residents express interest in wanting to solve parking on the neighborhood level. Some mentioned parking permitting, some mentioned accommodating more driveway space. Others indicated better multimodal options in public transit to alleviate the need for multiple cars on a household. So, so those are some of the things that came out of surveying when it came to that. Now, those are our needs, right? And our document gets into that in a full, as Anita mentioned, the appendices have a whole host of data that we encourage you to look at. So what are the barriers right now in Pomona? What are the governmental barriers in the city of Pomona and the non-governmental barriers that are limiting some of this need to be addressed? So we can get into that real quick. First, let's talk zoning. In the planning division wheelhouse of our Pomona zoning ordinance, we did find and do continue to experience outdated development standards that may limit housing development. Things like lot coverage, right? Is it reasonable to say that only 35% of a parcel should have a structure on it? Could that be increased to accommodate more housing scale, to maybe address some of that overcrowdingness, to maybe support some of the multi-generational living that we've identified? Parking. Now, as residents express, parking is a concern on an immediate ground level of where to park, but parking can also be quite a hindrance in the development of housing. To use a concrete example, if you're building more than 50% of an addition on a house in Pomona today, and you don't have a 2-car garage, that does trigger a requirement for a full 400 square foot 2-car garage to be built. And as you can imagine, depending on your lot size, that may be a hindrance for you to maybe have an ADU in there in the future, or to expand and do a house addition to accommodate your parents or something like that. So sometimes that parking requirements can be onerous and doesn't have enough relief to say, hey, open or tandem parking may be a solution, or there's alternative ways of parking that don't have to be a 2-car garage. There's also site constraints. So we see with different property development standards that sometimes developers find it difficult to accommodate landscaping and other metrics, and without any relief, are finding that instead of building maybe 2 or 3 extra units in order to accommodate some of these standards, they're having to limit the number of houses they build in our multi-unit neighborhoods, our R2s and 3s, and instead accommodate some of those needs. So that can be calibrated as well, and is considered a constraint. And then lastly, like I just mentioned, with 63% of our housing stock being single units, our zoning code was not permitting various housing types, right, as a constraint. And I'll explain in a moment with our SB 330 overlay how we're addressing that. In addition, and many of these we took a deep dive on in our document, but we have some outdated land use definitions that don't quite capture transitional and interim and supportive housing that we need to clean up. We don't have universal design standards and reasonable accommodations for persons with physical or developmental disabilities. That's very limited to our group care section right now, and we certainly can expand that. Our housing market, this is getting into non-governmental constraints. There's rising home values that are projected to persist, and that certainly is playing a role in housing affordability crises in Pomona. And then lastly, geographical and environmental considerations. So what is the risk of development in our hillside communities with wildland fires, and looking at that as well. So those are the barriers. Now, what is Pomona have to its advantage? What are its assets right now? Based on all those needs that I just mentioned, we know some of those constraints, but what can we play into and strengthen that Pomona's already been doing for the last several years? So the first thing that I wanted to mention, and this is where we talk about that RHNA number, that 10,558. Currently, and as we're presenting in this pro-housing document, the city has available, suitable land currently zoned to meet the RHNA allocation for all income levels without the risk of housing displacement. Now, how are we able to accomplish that projected need? 3 different ways through our inventory. The first is through our existing specific plans. We've identified 131 parcels in the Pomona Corridor Plan, which is Gary, Foothill, Holt, and Mission. Our downtown Pomona specific plan, which is about 250 acres right in downtown, and a couple of parcels in our Phillips Ranch, Rio Rancho Plaza that are zoned mixed use that can accommodate a significant number of housing development units and are already zoned for them. The next is what I had alluded to, is the SB 330 overlay. And I'll talk about that in a moment, but through that overlay, we have the capacity across 63 parcels to also accommodate housing for all income levels. And then lastly, we are projecting currently 2,184 ADUs to be constructed, permitted and constructed over the next 8 years. And that per state law and per guidance can be used to capture our inventory. So I want to share the first of 2 tables today. I'm not trying to do too many tables because data can get really complicated and hard to visualize, but I want to spend a minute, just walk through this table with you in terms of what I've been talking about. So let's look at that first line, right? RHNA, that's the Regional Housing Needs Assessment. That 10,558, how does that math work? There's 4 variables there. We look at very low income, mod, and above mod income. In terms of housing needs, these numbers are allocated to the city of Pomona. You can see 2,800 units or so, 1,300, 15, and 4,900. That second row gets into some of our unit capacity on the site inventory. So 2 things to keep in mind there. That first number you see total, 2,463 units. What does that number mean? That's what we call the pipeline. So there are 2,463 units as of right now that are either under entitlement or issued permits or are in construction since June 30th, a couple of months ago of 2021. So over 2,400 units are in the pipeline in the city of Pomona. It's quite a lot, and that makes up 300 low income and very low, and above moderate income is the majority of that. Then that number below it, 5,914, right? Those are the parcels that I just mentioned on SB 330 land, on Pomona Corridor specific plans, things of that nature. So 5,900 units that we can currently accommodate on existing zone land. Then we get into the ADU number, and you can see how that breaks out. And then that leads to 14,353 units of capacity. So that 10,558 number, as part of our pro-housing initiative, it was very imperative for us to make sure that we had a healthy buffer, that we weren't just trying to make math work, but really taking a concrete look at our entire neighborhood, looking at all of our housing needs and saying, as a citywide effort, where's all this housing going to go? And that's where we landed on a 36% buffer beyond our state obligations, a 64% buffer for above mod, a 10% buffer for moderate income, and a 12% buffer for very low and low income. Now, a point that I just kind of wanted to have a standalone, again, to ensure compliance with state law, SB 330, other bills, none of the sites that we've identified, those 200 plus parcels that will accommodate the 14,000 plus units, none of those would create a risk for displacement. And that was really important for the city to land on, which is they don't currently contain a housing development that would need to be demolished or a family would need to be displaced to build any one of those 14,000 units. These are on vacant sites. They may be on commercial or industrial redevelopment land, or they may be accessory units on existing property. So that's one of our biggest assets and resources right now for housing.
And I just want to add on to that point, Ata. I think that's a really huge point for Pomona. I think, and unlike many other cities, we are in a very good position. We're not upzoning any sites. We're not accounting for any displacement of existing residents or homes to accommodate that RHNA number. And so that's I think a really valuable point for Pomona, in that we're able to accommodate that growth within the existing density already contemplated by the city. And I think, again, that goes to some of the work that was done in 2014, laying the groundwork for that general plan, and some of the work that we've been carrying through with the SB 330 overlay and other measures. So I just wanted to emphasize that point and how important that is for Pomona, that all of our sites are contained within the city without any upzoning or displacement.
Absolutely, yeah, definitely. And to build on that, so what are other resources and assets that we have in our existing resource analysis? And the second is CEQA. So if you're not familiar with CEQA, quick and dirty on that is that it's a California Environmental Quality Act. All projects that involve some level of discretion have to go through environmental review through CEQA law. Over the last 4 years, the city of Pomona has very seriously and aggressively and progressively streamlined its CEQA process. So in 2014, that general plan I mentioned, our blueprint that was updated, it went through an EIR process where they studied all of the density that we're talking about today. All of that was already studied and evaluated. CEQA law enables you to streamline and rely on that data to allow housing units to come in that are consistent with that general plan environmental impact report and that corridor environmental impact report. So we've taken full advantage of that. We've streamlined in the last 4 years many of those projects. And what that translates to in terms of a resource is that where it may have taken up to 18 months to conduct a CEQA review in the city of Pomona in years past, that review is 6 months or less today on average. We're taking less than 6 months. And this isn't less than 6 months with just moving forward and saying we have a general plan. It's less than 6 months with doing evidence-based studies of the general plan, consistency evaluations with our bench of environmental consultants, and putting together all of that evidence to really understand what is the true impact here that hasn't been studied before. And so that's really important for housing production, to not have housing unnecessarily be limited by environmental reviews that may have already been conducted in the city of Pomona. The next asset, and this gets into housing programs, and sorry, I think it went too fast here. There we go. We could talk about our housing authority, right? We're fortunate to be one of those rare cities that has its own housing authority, right? And we also have a neighborhood services and housing services department that you heard from this morning. So the city's already actively providing public subsidies, programs, education to support affordable and fair housing in the city of Pomona. So there's 4 ways of doing it, 3 of them in front of you here today. Interim, transitional, and supportive housing is already a program that's pursued by Housing Services. We have a homelessness continuum of care strategic plan. We have the Hope for Home shelter that opened in December 2018. We've been involved with Project Room Key in providing support for PUSD families on the risk of homelessness, veterans homelessness, a whole host of programs that are supporting interim, transitional, and supportive care. Then healthy homes is a big component, lead testing and lead reduction, housing improvements for folks with physical disabilities and ADA access issues, home rehabilitation loans. Those have already been taking place in the city of Pomona. And affordable housing development. So through the Community Housing Development Organization program, through the Permanent Local Housing Allocation, PLHA, a lot of these acronyms really get down to the heart of 2 things, what we call set-asides and gap funding. The Pomona Housing Authority and Neighborhood Services Department actively fill those gaps. If you have a 100% affordable housing project and it needs some gap financing, we have done those to much success in recent years on affordable housing projects. And a lot of that you can read about in the report. Now that 4th one I mentioned that's on the screen for you is really rental assistance, some of those needs I was mentioning earlier. And I wanted to spend its own slide on that because we have the second of 2 tables. I don't think there's any more tables here. The second of 2 tables to really explain what the Pomona Housing Authority is currently doing with rental assistance vouchers. Now, most folks may think of this as just Section 8 vouchers, right, is a common term that gets used. It's really important to understand the nuance and the various ways that Pomona has and continue to support rental assistance among its residents. And so what you're looking at the table, if you look at the bottom right here, there's $20 million plus in funding that are actively being deployed in the city of Pomona towards rental assistance. and that's for 1,110 individuals. So a brunt of that is the housing choice voucher, what you may know as Section 8, which is a reference to the government code, 905 vouchers for low-income families. But there's also a combination of 60 vouchers for homeless veterans. That's through project-based and HUD-VASH vouchers. If you've been on, if you drive past Park and Commercial recently in downtown, you've seen the Veterans AmCal housing go up. That took advantage of those VASH vouchers. A project-based voucher enables that affordability to stay with the project over time. It's not going with the individual, it's staying with that project. We also have 63 vouchers that are considered mainstream for non-elderly, disabled, and homeless families. 4 vouchers that were allocated just this year for foster youth tenant protection for transitional age youth, and then 78 new vouchers that were plugged in this year, representing $1.6 million of emergency housing vouchers that the city allocates for homeless, at-risk homeless, victims of domestic violence, and households at risk of housing instability. So again, we heard a lot of this among our housing needs assessment. The surveys were filled with questions about rental assistance. So it's really important to understand what are our current programs and how much money are we spending, and can we increase that support? Lastly, on Section 3 here with resources, the city's inclusionary housing ordinance. So this was passed this year. Housing developments in the city of Pomona as of today with more than 3 units proposed have to allocate a certain percentage of units for moderate income. And if eligible, they could pay an in lieu fee instead into our Affordable Housing Trust Fund. This is a big deal because it does ensure that moderate income housing and gets at some of that missing middle and workforce housing that I mentioned. Now, we've talked needs, we've talked constraints, we've talked resources. Let's talk a little bit about fair housing and then we'll get into the goals. So what's the term is used is affirmatively furthering fair housing. That's the official designation. What does fair housing look like in Pomona? There's a couple of things that you should really know just as salient points here. Discriminatory housing practices towards residents of color persist in Pomona. It is happening today, it continues to happen. There's an overall lack of affordable housing for low-income residents that was identified. There's challenges finding housing near economic opportunities, job-work balances. There are inherent landlord-tenant conflicts and unresolved fair housing disputes that are taking place, or landlords unwilling to accept rental assistance. Those $20 million in vouchers that I mentioned, there's unwillingness to accept those vouchers as a source of income. Some of that has been addressed by recent state legislation, but that continues. And there's unsafe and unsanitary living conditions and housing problems in many units in Pomona. In addition, the AFFH, the acronym we're using, AFFH, identified 2 census tracts with a significant population that's what we call a recap, which is a racial or ethnic concentration of poverty in Pomona. So if a census tract in Pomona has more than 50% of a minority population and more than 40% of them are considered low income, then that is a concentrated area of poverty. We have 2. The first is generally located between White and Dudley along Holt Avenue, which is 94% minority, 291 owner-occupied units. We have another one by the Indoor Valley Swap Meet on East End and Holt. Those 2 areas are important for 2 reasons. One, there's vulnerability there in those census tracts. But there's also assets, right? There's concentrations of poverty, but there's also concentrations of a specific minority group that finds cultural assets and value in those neighborhoods and informal resources. So it's really important for us in our programming to study that, really understand how we can play into the assets and not play into the barriers, right? And so that's an ongoing conversation with fair housing in Pomona. We also have some additional challenges that I won't spend too much time into today because we could spend a whole seminar just on environmental justice, but there are high exposures to pollutants in Pomona. We have increased pollution burdens, well documented, and we have high public health vulnerabilities in Pomona through the CalEnviroscreen model that's frequently cited for this. We also have UC Davis conducted a study for regional economic opportunity and identified that there's various neighborhoods in Pomona that have moderate to low levels of economic opportunity. That mobility, the upward mobility is very limited compared to other cities. And so that leads to fair housing challenges as well. So let's talk about the plan a little bit. And the way I want to talk about this plan is maybe as a little bit of a setup and homework for everybody here and for folks that you want interested in this the next 30 days. Really just sharing with you the five key goals. These 5 goals that you're about to see represent what the city of Pomona currently feels best reflect the housing needs that we identified, best reflect our ability to address constraints, to play into and deepen our resources, and to affirmatively further fair housing. Rather than getting into every policy and goal, we really invite you to spend the next month reading through that plan for Pro-Housing Pomona and to see if it checks your boxes, if it makes sense when you read it, that it truly is reflecting some of the needs that we've identified in the document. So let's talk about those 5 goals. Goal number 1 is about land use. Goal 1 is saying that Pomona's land use regulations will encourage the development and preservation of safe, healthy, and affordable housing, as well as a variety of housing types, homeownership models, and designs. Now, what does that look like on the ground in terms of programs? The biggest effort is our Pomona zoning ordinance update. We're already started in July, but we're going to be spending the next year and a half updating our zoning code. The first major overhaul of the zoning code in 70 years since the code was first adopted in 1951. That is our biggest opportunity to really address many of these housing needs, some of that lot coverage, some of those housing ownership type models, thinking about subdivisions and lot splits and things of that nature. The second program is really what we call by right housing. So how do you enable housing to go through a streamlined process? How do you permit housing in a way that's predictable and objective and easy for a developer, a mom and pop developer, or a big developer to understand, right? That's really important. And then public benefits and incentives. We have an inclusionary housing program. We have a mandate for moderate income. But are there other tools in our toolkit that we can use to really encourage more affordable housing citywide? So land use regulation is goal number 1. Goal number 2 is some of that government funding and education that I mentioned. If you think of that $20 million reflected on that chart, we're talking about a goal that is about the city and the housing authority, PHA, actively supporting Pomona residents with additional financial resources and education to secure safe, decent, and sanitary housing. So continuing the strategic plan to combat and end homelessness, continuing interim and transitional rental assistance, exploring alternative models like community land trusts, exploring models of developing on city-owned public parking lots, thinking about development on public assembly and houses of worship sites, and really studying how we can use that local affordable housing trust fund and the regional trust fund to deepen affordability in all our neighborhoods. Goal number 3 is at the household level. So goal 3 is households, goal 4 is neighborhoods. So on an individual household level, a lot of those needs that were expressed. This goal is getting at that. So the goal is that Pomona's households should have the resources to improve their property, to continue living in Pomona across multiple generations, to build income and equity, and to be shielded from displacement and rapid changes in affordability. This is very important for an individual level. Now, some of those things can look like express permitting for ADUs and additional units to make that as straightforward and pre-approved as possible. To look at cultural norms and practices. We want to conduct a study as part of our zoning update to really see how does our population use their front yard? How do they use their backyards? How do they use their property? What are they interested in doing on their property that they may not be able to do today that could, if addressed, accommodate families healthily and happily living together? So that lot use study is important. Thinking about lot splits. So really thinking about, is it possible if there's a 1,200 square foot ADU in a neighborhood today in the city of Pomona that's legally allowed? What is the public health and code difference if that was a 1,200 square foot ADU that could actually be a second unit that could be sold and potentially generate wealth for that family? That's a different conversation than rental income, right? But really thinking about multi-generational wealth in a way that fits Pomona's needs and demand. Looking at rent stabilization policies and feasibility for local tenant protections. Thinking about local versions of tenant protections is really critical, as some of these state protections may sunset at some point. And then lastly, just as an example, is home-based businesses. So not everything about housing is just the living of it in terms of people living together, but it's also about, in an effort to shield against displacement and affordability, is enabling the hundreds of home-based businesses and home occupations that exist in Pomona, meaningfully deepening that commitment to understanding how home-based businesses can continue to work in Pomona and to continue to afford the ability for an individual to maybe not have to pay rent on a brick and mortar, to maybe conduct their business out of their home in the city of Pomona. Goal number 4 gets at that neighborhood scale. So let's think of all the individual households living together in a neighborhood. Pomona's households would be supported by a strong network of resources and amenities that encourage quality public health outcomes. So a couple of efforts that I want to highlight real quick. The citywide Complete Streets Ordinance, we received a $700,000 grant from a regional body, SCAG, to really study multimodal streets and to reconceptualize Pomona's streets. We're working on our Parks and Facilities Master Plan to really understand the needs for park space citywide. We will continue to pursue the Mills Act and a historic preservation program. We staff the Historic Preservation Commission to really ensure that we're not damaging or destroying historic resources and protecting them to the extent possible. Integrating our wonderful public art fund and program into the neighborhoods and to really understand how residents want to use public art to enhance quality of life in their neighborhoods. And then lastly, an important point here, supporting local serving resources. So we talked a little bit about this with home-based businesses, but as you build and as you grow, and again, quality of life is the hallmark for goal 4 here, it's not just about building the housing, but it has to be about local serving retail, about the infrastructure and support and social network that goes into that housing, the mutual aid, the urban agricultural opportunities, the community gardens, keeping that neighborhood market intact and shielding it from displacement. These are things that we do inherently have to study and understand as we grow and meet all of our housing targets. So that's where goal 4 comes in. And then lastly,
briefly, Atai, before you leave that, I'll just emphasize again that our team here in Pomona has taken a particular emphasis on that neighborhood resources and quality of life issue. You'll see from other jurisdictions where there's such a push from the state legislature at the moment to build units really at all costs. And in Pomona, we really have tried to counter that with really thoughtful neighborhood resources. So that way it's not just housing units going in and no thought about the community in which we're building. And so that's what we've really tried to focus on in that section and really tried to build out and create environments that don't just house people, but are environments where people want to live.
Absolutely, yeah. Very critical point there. And, so that gets into goal 5, the last goal here. It's a fair housing goal. It's called justice and transparency, but it's really about affirmatively furthering fair housing. Some of that fair housing stuff, data and findings that we found in section 4. So Pomona's housing policy will actively support fair and equal housing opportunities for all persons, regardless of race, religion, sex, marital status, ancestry, national origin, family status, physical challenges, color, protected classes. In order to do that, there's a couple of things that we have developed as programs. The first is really, and as you'll see more fleshed out in the document, is fair housing is in a sense important to address in all of the goals I just mentioned. So when it comes to goal 1 about land use, there's a program about fair housing and land use. When we develop regulations, when we update our zoning code, are we looking at historical past practice? Are we looking at historical redlining as we are with Anita's efforts here? Are we looking at how land use has been used in ways that was not furthering fair housing, but doing quite the opposite? Then on a housing authority and programmatic side, how do we ensure there's fair housing being met in the way we invest in our community and provide rental assistance or programs? And then on the neighborhood and individual scale, are our choices intentionally or unintentionally creating harm to certain segments of the population that we need to be very aware of? And so part of that effort, the more broad effort here, is really thinking about environmental justice, transformative justice, thinking about resilience and climate change. These are all interrelated issues that cut at the heart of fair housing. And so we do intend to work on a new general plan element. Again, the housing element is a chapter of the general plan, but adding another chapter that will address public health and EJ and transformative justice and climate resilience into a unified element that will now be able to establish some indicators and maybe think about how we can address fair housing in a more interdependent way. That includes some data sharing with the public on affordable housing and deed restrictions that already exist, and really continuing to make those data-driven decisions. So with all that said, I know that was quite a bit to digest, but we have 30 days together with this public draft. The comment period opened on September 30th, Thursday, and it's open through October 30th. If you go right now to pomonaca.gov/prohousing, I love how short our URLs are now. I'm just going to keep using those, but pomonaca.gov/prohousing, you'll be able to find all of the documents that I'm referencing here, and we strongly encourage you to provide feedback. So we have an online form that you can fill out. You can send me an email, or you can visit us at City Hall and we can have a chat. But this document is a draft. It's just that. It's intended to be looked at by the entire community, by all of our stakeholders, and to be adjusted as needed. And so with that, we have some next steps that I'd generally like to share. We're in that public review period. We would then take those comments, integrate them, incorporate them, send it over to the state for their review. And then in January, revise those drafts, go forward with the Planning Commission and the City Council for adoption. With that, we can open it up, but that's the end of our presentation on the Pro Housing Pomona draft for the City of Pomona.
And let's see, there's a few questions here. What can city do to assure that new affordable housing will mainly benefit existing residents versus new people moving here to take advantage? Should the city care about this? Thanks, Michael. So I think, yes, we absolutely should care about this. And that goes to some of our housing preservation policies and displacement policies to ensure that the residents of Pomona get first chance at that. So we're working on some of those policies as well within the housing element. Great. Paula likes the presentation in the format. Thank you, Paula.
And Anita, if I could go back to that one that you had answered earlier in mid-presentation about the affordability restrictions, I think that's a good program to note, that typically affordability covenants, and when I refer to this, I mean that on your property, there's something recorded against that property that says this has to be rented at affordable rates for 45 or 55 years, that our program is looking at exploring that for a 99-year period, which really helps address some of that risk of conversion. If something's up for affordability restrictions ending next year, how do we ensure that? And so that's one tool that you can look at.
And then Michael's asking if we see an important role for community-based organizations and nonprofits and private citizens on promoting affordable housing. Yes, I think absolutely. I think both in the production of affordable housing as well as the involvement in the community of what's needed to help support that housing as well. And with those partnerships, we're hoping through the public health lens to really bring in some nonprofits to do community engagement one-on-one to get specific feedback from the community that and from certain aspects of the community that may not normally interact with government. And so really trying to use that nonprofit model to be the bridge. And so we're really hoping to support and partner with our nonprofits and community-based organizations to help us do that and really help inform the process. And it looks like Habitat for Pomona Valley is very interested in the lot split to allow ADUs. Great, we'll definitely reach out, Christine. Thank you for that. Love Habitat. I think both Ata and myself have both participated in builds in other countries through Habitat.
That's right, Guatemala.
Yep. Is there anywhere for incorporating undocumented previously hidden conversations that can be upgraded and forgiven and then added to our number of new housing units? Oh, well, actually, so I'm assuming you're meaning units that weren't previously counted. There is actually some new legislation, state legislation that may be helpful in that regard that may allow for it. So it's the conversion of units. They have to have a 30-year affordability, which is a little bit interesting in that we would require a 55-year. So it kind of takes out some of those projects that some of the language don't mesh with the legislation that's being proposed and what's actually happening in the affordability. But there is some push at the state level to allow for that, and that goes towards that preservation of the housing as well.
And I think in addition to that, if there's been say an unpermitted garage conversion from 10 years ago or something like that, that program about express permitting and pre-approved ADUs. We're already seeing a lot of garage conversions and legalization of units, and I think we're going to continue seeing that. But by having a pre-approved format, it really encourages a legal pathway to very quickly and cheaply have a garage conversion or an additional unit created. And so, those all count. Those conversions, once you legalize them, those count as a unit towards our RHNA, which is great. And then Michael asked a question about cover lot splits. New state law does address some lot splits. That's SB 9. And just briefly on SB 9, I'll just mention that I think Pomona is in a really unique and good position to address SB 9 and kind of do it in a manner that on our own terms. And that's, again, kind of going back to some of the progressive land use decisions and policies that we've been bringing forth over the last year. And so over the next month or two, we will be putting a lot more out on that and how we're going to address it and how we believe our existing framework and policies address that. So be on the lookout for that, Michael. And then, are there restrictions on what churches can build in terms of living units on their properties? So there are, I guess, and this kind of goes to our SB 330 issue, I think, Atah. So I guess just briefly on that, I'll say there are zoning restrictions, but a lot of these lots is what we're seeing is that they're covered under SB 330. So density is allowed. So really the density is not an issue. We do have in place now a DPR process, a development plan review process to look at aesthetics. What I will note in that, Atah mentioned that we included some of those church sites in our inventory, is that we were also very careful to not count those sites in its entirety. So we really kind of split the site. If it was, a 5-acre site, we said half of it could be potentially developed as housing, purposefully not trying to ensure that we don't have an erasure of these religious institutions, but we also allow for the housing. So we're hoping that those religious institutions can remain and also take advantage of utilizing the site to build housing and help their economic performance. Yeah, absolutely. And I would just add to that from a definitional standpoint, once you're in the realm of residential zoning, which, like Anita mentioned, majority of the houses of worship are, it's treated like any other residential unit, right? Whether it can provide supportive housing or transitional housing or multi-units or things of that nature.
And then Benita just added a comment here to, thank you, Benita. So to assure that some of the new affordable housing units focus on housing Pomona households, the Pomona Housing Authority, which Benita oversees, is providing project-based vouchers to these projects that will draw their renters from a Pomona priority waiting list. And I think Tom mentioned that, in Benita's previous work session, she kind of went over the emphasis on the project-based vouchers as well. So excellent point, Benita. And then we have a question about tiny homes. As part of our programming, I forget which program number it is, but we do look to explore the regulations and zoning around allowing for tiny homes. So it is something we have heard from the community in the months previous, and we have brought that over into our programs and policies as something we do want to explore going forward. And then Michael, and this might be our last question or two, because I think we're right at time. What sort of work is being done on community land trusts in Pomona?
Yeah, so if you want to take that, Anita, or I can.
Yeah, well, I think we're at the beginning stages of looking to explore it really. So I think one of the first steps is we've put it in as a specific policy and program to explore. And so it's kind of cementing our efforts to explore it and to move forward with it. We're acknowledging that that's what we want to do. So between Benita's shop and our shop and Kirk is what I like to refer to as the 3 pillars of housing. If anyone's heard me talk about that before, the economic development component, the programming component through neighborhood services, and the land use component through development services, we are working together to move forward that idea of a community land trust. So Judy, I think we're at time. Is there any other questions that I missed or?
I think you captured them all. Thank you so much, Anita and Ata. We really appreciate this review of the draft housing element. It was really great to hear all that perspective, and you all covered it really well. So thank you all. We are at time. However, we will pick it back up at 12:30. We will take a short lunch break from 12 to 12:30. And at 12:30, the next session that we'll have is our Building a Vision Together session. So we really hope to hear a lot from you all and continue hearing the conversation and getting feedback from all the sessions that we've heard as well. So thank you all. We'll hang out here if folks have any other questions, and we will see you soon. Thank you.